You good? You can hear me?
We can hear you. We can see
Yes,
you.
Great.
yes.
I have no idea what that was. Uh, just a setting in my computer. Okay. How are you guys?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Good. So we're going to begin. Um, Let me just mute. Okay. Um, so this week's parasha is. Sorry, I've got the less fancy background this week. This week's parsha is Parsha Kitavo. Um, and in a way, from a point of view of the name of the parsha, it is very much a continuation of last week's parsha in name. Last week's parsha was Kitetse, which means when you go out. Kitavo means when you arrive. Now, they're not actually two parts of a sentence or even a paragraph, because Kitetse was when you go out to war. It had nothing to do with going out of one place to another. Kitavo, though, is very much about where you're arriving, when you come in. When you come into Israel is what this parasha is talking about. When you arrive in the land of Israel, here are some things that I want you to do. And so we immediately open up the parasha with laws that actually relate to agriculture. So what we see here, before I even get into today's topics, we see a very, very interesting idea that when are you home? Where is your home? It's where you eat. It's where you really live. Eating halachically is one of the definitions of what makes a home. So if you sleep in a place but you eat elsewhere, there's a serious question in halacha: where is your home? Likewise, if you eat at home but you sleep somewhere else, where is your home? So when you arrive into Israel, how do we know we're home? It's when we are growing plants and we are harvesting the food and we are eating. Like when we are dependent on the land of Israel, we know we've arrived. So that is a very, I think it's a very nice message there, a very nice way of relating to where you're from. You're from wherever you're nurtured. So when we think about who we are, when we think about our identity that we have, people, if you ask someone, well, define yourself. So some people say, well, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm Jewish, I'm a father, I'm a mother. People have many different, I'm a human, people have many different definitions for themselves. One could say all of those things are correct, but I would say we are what we are at our very core, and what nurtures us will very much help define who we are. So yes, I'm a human, but I look at it as I'm a Jew, because my very existence is because I have an neshama, because I have a soul, and that defines my existence. So you're home when you're eating, you're home when you're connected with that deeper part of yourself. So I've got two topics this week because I have to finish a bit earlier than normal. But this week, let me just get it here. So the first topic I want to cover today is the idea of bringing sacrifices in the Western world. In this week's Parsha, we've got a number of sacrifices. We have sacrifices which are not of animal. We have sacrifices of fruit, vegetable matter, vegetable content, which is a really interesting idea, because generally when you think of sacrifices, you think of sheep, cows, whatever. You don't think of a basket full of fruit. You also generally, when talk about sacrifices, think of an altar and you think of fire. And a sacrifice of fruit does not get burnt, as we find in this week's parsha. So the sacrifice of fruit in the parsha this week is bikurim, which is the first fruit. So at the end of winter, your crop begins to grow, and then you have your very, very first harvest, your first fruit coming off the trees, your first grain that is ready to be harvested. So we're talking like 6 weeks into spring. That very first fruit that comes off the tree is not ours to eat or sell. It's ours. We need to take it to Jerusalem, and it is to be used in a religious and spiritual context. It's eaten and it's celebrated. In fact, Shavuot, because remember, Shavuot is the northern hemisphere. The Beis Hamikdash is in the northern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, spring is what begins in April, and so by late April and May, you've got your first fruit, and that corresponds to Pesach being the beginning of spring, and Shavuot being the time of the first harvest of when that first fruit was actually cut. And then Chag HaBikurim, the festival of the new fruit, is another name for Shavuot. Shavuot, people would come to Jerusalem and they'd bring their fruit offerings in Jerusalem. So we've got this idea of sacrifice, but it's not your classic sacrifice. And I thought it's important to explore what is sacrifice, and do we bring sacrifices today? Should we bring sacrifice today? Or are we so progressed as a society, and of course I'm a little cynical when I say that, that we don't bring sacrifices. So the very notion of sacrifices would abhor people in the West. The idea of killing an animal for God, that is an abhorrent, ridiculous and just ancient behavior that's so inappropriate. But killing an animal for human is actually okay. I'm just pointing out it's a really strange idea. If it's for me, it's okay. If it's for something I don't understand, that's not okay. So if you're vegan, it's not because of, or you're vegetarian because of philosophical principles, then it's never okay. Okay, at least you're consistent. But most people in the West are not vegetarian. And I find it really interesting that the idea of animal sacrifice is abhorrent, but the idea of animal consumption en masse and modern farming practices, that is completely acceptable. So I'm pointing out that dissonance because it's very, very important that when we talk about things, we understand that it's very possible that we're not doing things because of some attitude, not necessarily because something is antiquated. So what is the concept of a sacrifice? Will help us understand a few things as to whether we should or shouldn't bring sacrifices today. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm really challenging Australian and, of course, overall Western thinking. I'm challenging Australian thinking towards religion. Generally, in the West, religion is seen as somewhat antiquated. Spirituality has made a lovely resurgence. We're in a golden age of Western spirituality. So the logical and helpful parts of a religion, happy to bastardize and take it and dissect it as much as we want. So we'll take a bit of meditation from Buddhism. Don't worry about the orange clothes and all that. We're just going to take the meditation. Don't worry about what the purpose of the meditation is, as long as you're feeling good. We'll take the idea of Shabbos from Judaism. Not Shabbos, not going to shul or praying or stopping to dry my car. I'm just looking to stop, maybe just stop talking to people on the phone as much. I'm not talking about a secular Jew here. I'm talking about the idea of secularizing something that is very inherently sacred and quite robust in its thinking and development. And just because it's not logical or practical or useful to a Westerner does not mean that there's lost information here or useless information here. What we're actually talking about is a depth of knowledge that perhaps is being shunned. I had a teacher when I was in yeshiva who used to always share a very cynical attitude towards science. Now, interestingly, he was one of the teachers that really got me to embrace and love science. But he said science is the discovery and the exploration of what is, but don't for a second think that if science hasn't discovered it, it doesn't exist. And therefore, science should be used very philosophically. Science should be used to discover the beauty of Hashem's world, not to negate the God that exists. So he used to always tell the story of they wanted to do a survey of all the sea creatures. So what they did was they cast many nets, and they were able to cast the net through the whole ocean. Now, after they did that, they were able to capture all the different sea species and all the different plants, and they assessed them. And at the end of a many-year study, they said we can conclusively conclude that there is no creature in the ocean that is smaller than 2 millimeters. Wow, what an incredible study. We even now know what the smallest creature is. Until one fisherman presented himself to this to the unveiling of this incredible thesis and the lecture, and says, look, I'm just a fisherman, I'm no scientist, but can I please ask you one question? How large were the holes of your net? So, of course, there's nothing that's less than 2 millimeters in the sea, because your net has 2 millimeter holes, so anything that's less falls through. So, my teacher was very into the study is very important. However, remember that there are 2 millimeter holes. So, what we don't know, it's not that it doesn't exist. Be open to what we don't know and celebrate what we do know. So, I use that by way of introduction to this discussion of what is a sacrifice. So if we look in this week's parasha where we're taught about the fruit sacrifice, what Hashem says is that that fruit must be brought to Jerusalem. It belongs to me. That fruit is mine. It is not yours. It may have grown on your tree, and you may have tilled the soil and done everything. It's my fruit. In fact, it's all mine. All I'm asking you to do is bring a sacrifice. Now, if we look in the book of Yeshaya, and I apologize, I did mention this in last night's Zoom very briefly, but I'm very consumed with this idea right now. Yeshaya is a very interesting prophet, Isaiah, because he lives in a particularly well-to-do time of Jewish history. It's the First Temple period. There are two empires. There is the Judean Empire and there is the Israelite Empire, because Israel in fact split into two empires. There was a rift and disagreements. And so they've got two monarchies. Jerusalem is in Judea, and it is the spiritual and religious center of life, but Israel is a larger piece of land which has a larger population, which is where we talk about the 10 lost tribes. This is where they exist before they're lost. And Isaiah, now the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah are not necessarily very God-fearing individuals. There's corruption, there's all sorts of things. It's like any other political system. And Isaiah says, people, we're just not, you're just not getting the point of Judaism. So what are you talking about? We've got a temple, we've got a high priest, we've got priests, we've got Levites, we've got sacrifices every day. Everything's working fine. What are you talking about? And Isaiah says, God doesn't need your sacrifices. God doesn't care for your burnt animals and your new fruit. There is no such thing as a God that cares about these things. They're like, what are you talking about? He says, God is not some big judgmental man in the sky. The metaphors in the Torah are complex ideas that use human language to try to transmit them. But don't for a second think that God has hands and a face and loves the smell of barbecued meat. Hashem is the infinite. Hashem is everything and exists within everything and is the consciousness of everything and is the source of everything. And what Hashem wants is that humanity should be able to consciously mimic and develop their own awareness, and through the process of sacrifice start to connect to Hashem in a more profound way. It is not just about the ritual. Now, the ritual itself is very important, because without the ritual, how do you achieve it? You might say you can make up your own rituals. Well, the Torah says not so. This is the physical way to do it. So, but the ritual itself, without the intention, is lacking. And so one needs to realize that the sacrifice is a gesture and an activity that impacts the mind, and in turn, the mind and the soul impacts the activity. So it's a bit like when we eat food, we think the food's nourishing us. Well, that's a very one-way relationship. But what if I tell you, when we eat food, it's nourishing us to have the energy to do something. But when we do something, it's not just the positive thing that we're doing, but the food that we ate now becomes a part of it. So the food nourishes us, and we in turn spiritually elevate the food. There's a two-way relationship here. And so when we do a mitzvah, on the one hand, it's triggering something within our own soul and within ourselves. And conversely, we are also triggering something in the soul of the object that we are engaging in a mitzvah with. So the purpose of the sacrifice is not about just killing an animal. It is not just about bringing fruit to Jerusalem. It's what the intention that goes along with that is. Now, one of the principles of sacrifice is the idea of sacrificing the self. what is the idea of sacrifice? What is a korban? The Hebrew word korban does not mean killing. The Hebrew word korban is from the same as the Hebrew word hakrava. Kuf resh vase is the shorish, it's the root. Korev means to bring close. So korban is to bring something close. It's to bring the object close, but it's also to bring oneself close. When we are practicing egocentricity, we are making ourselves distant from everything. When we practice humility, we're coming closer to things. So the purpose of the korban is that the killing of an animal and the burning of it is meant to trigger a response within us that is making us want to overcome our own animalistic side of ego and to sublimate it, to bring it as a sacrifice, to bring our own internal ego closer to Hashem so that it becomes a power of humility. Because if you destroy your animal soul, you're not going to eat, you're not going to drink, you're not going to engage with people. We need that. But we want to do that stuff in a meaningful spiritual way. That's hakrava, that's the sacrifice. That idea has never died. That idea of bringing our animal soul and bringing ourselves closer to Hashem as the role, as the purpose of day-to-day living has never gone away. What left was the process of actually bringing the physical sacrifice. And the reason why that was lost was because the temple was destroyed. And the Torah is very clear that you've got to bring sacrifices in the allocated place. And once the temple was built, you couldn't bring a sacrifice outside of the temple. So in the absence of a temple, we can't bring a sacrifice. But it is not because we don't bring sacrifices in 2020 that we don't bring sacrifices. It is because we don't have a temple. If we had a temple, we would bring sacrifices. Now, if you look at Maimonidean writing, Rambam seems to indicate in his Moreh Nevuchim, which is not his halachic writings, but his philosophical writings, that actually there's an element of bringing sacrifices because that was something that was common to religions of the day. Okay, so that doesn't mean that it's been phased out. That just explains that it was common and therefore very acceptable. But one could say that the world was in general a more spiritual place back then, and therefore all activities and all religious behaviors across all religions was highly, highly spiritual. Today we live in a far less spiritual way, and therefore religion and religious conduct is seen as nothing more but culture and community building. And therefore it's the attitude of humanity that has changed, not the relevance of the activity of a sacrifice. So we don't have a temple today, so we don't bring the sacrifices, but the intention of Bikurim, which is what the very first part of this week's Parsha is that when you see fruit growing, you should say that fruit, that's from Hashem. And I'm deeply appreciative. And not only am I deeply appreciative, I still would like to ensure that that fruit is elevated. So when we eat that fruit off the tree, we should be intentional that this is a gift from Hashem, and we should be very conscious about how we're going to use the energy derived from eating that fruit, and likewise any animal or any food in general that should be. And so every time we eat, it's actually it can potentially be an act of korban, an act of hakrav, an act of bringing something close. The shulchan, our table, is actually a representation of the mizbeach, of the altar, which is why we have customs such as we don't stand on a table. We don't sit on a table. We consider a table which people eat on a sacred space. It's also why when we sit down to eat, particularly when we're eating bread, we always have salt. Because in the sacrifices in the temple, there were different elements. There was the bread, which is grain. There was the fruit of the new year, of the new agricultural year. There were the animals. There was wine and there was water. And so we've got different elements. Salt represents the mineral element of the world, or the ocean. Different opinions. Water doesn't necessarily represent ocean, it represents rain. So we've got different representations when we eat of the Mizbeach itself, of the altar itself, and therefore actually every time we eat, it is actually an act of korban, it is an act of sacrifice. So what I hope to have achieved is dispel this idea that we don't do sacrifices because that's old-fashioned, but rather we don't have a temple to bring sacrifices in. And number two, every time we eat is actually an act of korban. Any questions on that?
I'd just like to point out that salt is one of the main electrolytes in our bodies, and our neurons couldn't work at all without it.
That's very cool. So now one of the main components of our body, we now can pay even more respect to why it's part of the korban process. Thank you. Okay, later in this parasha, Moshe tells us that we are the chosen people. It's not the first time we've been told that, by the way. Let me just find it. Where is it? It's right at the end of the parasha, and it's in the middle of the parasha. He says that Hashem has given us a heart to recognize, eyes to see, ears to hear, that things are very deliberate. But where are the words? Hashem, that we are the chosen people. Oh, yeah. I should have written down a note for myself. My question is, and the question I want to discuss, not so much the question, the clarification I want to give is, what does it mean to be the chosen people? And I actually would like to explain this on two levels. Because being the chosen people has caused a hell of a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. Being the chosen people has made people really hate us. Oh, you think you're superior. So being the chosen people is not a superiority at all. So I want to start on a basic explanation. And the metaphor that I want to give is a construction site. So if you would go to a construction site with me, and I'd say, okay, who is the most important person on this construction site? You wouldn't know. So we line everyone up and say, sorry, laborers, sorry to cut into your day. Who here is the most important person? So immediately the foreman will stand forward and say, I am the most important person because I'm in charge of the construction site and I'm keeping pace. And an electrician steps forward and says, with all due respect, I love that you keep the calendar and that you check who's at work, but without me, there'd be no light on this construction site or in this building. And the plumber says, I don't mean to undermine anyone's authority here, but you can have all the electricity you want. Without a toilet, you're not going to last in this building for 6 hours. And the bricklayer says, okay, I don't want to say anything. You can have all the electricity and all the plumbing. Without a building, you've got nothing to plumb or electrify. And so on and so forth. Every laborer comes forward and says, actually, it's me. Then the cement pourers say, actually, we are the most important because without foundations, you've got no building to build on. And then the bank manager walks in and says, actually, I'm the most important because without money, none of you have a job. There's no project being financed. So everyone's important. And the truth is everyone is important, not just because, oh, we're all important, but actually we can see that if any one of those is missing, we've got a serious gap in our finished product. So to be chosen doesn't mean that no one else is chosen. To be chosen means that we've been chosen for something very specific, just as you choose an electrician to do something specific, and you choose a plumber to do something specific, and we don't just say, oh, I'd like to be egalitarian. I want to be egalitarian. I would like anyone that would like to be a plumber. Please step forward and do the plumbing. Anyone that wants to identify as an electrician, come and step forward. There is none of that. It doesn't mean that there's a pecking order and there's a priority. Sure, there's an order of how work has to happen. Sure, there is a process here, but every role is required and every tradie is chosen for their work. So in context of that, the Jewish people have been chosen, not to the exclusion of everyone else, but yes, to the exclusion of everyone else. So it's not that we're chosen and everyone else is riffraff, but rather from all the nations of the world, we have been chosen. Exclusion of all the other nations, of all the other tradies, we have been chosen for a particular task on this construction site. And no other tradie is going to do that task. And no other tradie has the capability to do that task. No plumber can be an electrician. No one who has a different soul type can do what we do. Likewise, our soul type is not meant to do other things. It's very, very clear. You find it in the Gemara, you find it in the Mishnah. I'll give you a very interesting example. It's discouraged for Jewish people to become a part of government. We're not supposed to be forming governments in countries which are outside of Israel. Be a part of society, play a role, give charity, be functional, get a job, contribute, lobby, vote, all those things. Just don't be the government. It's not our role. There are other people whose role it is to be government. So I'm showing you that there is a person that can stand up, like right now. Say there are elections in America. You can have a whole lot of people on stage. Let's say you got 4 people of different faiths. One of them is Jewish, and the other 3 have different faiths. They can all turn to the Jewish person and say, the reason why we think we're more qualified than you to be the president of this country is because your heritage says that we should be governing the country. And that's a fairly legitimate thing. Now, I think if someone tried that, they would be accused of anti-Semitism. And I'm coming at this from an academic point of view. And that is that everyone is chosen for a particular role. That's number one. So when we talk about being the chosen nation, Moshe doesn't go into, and they're chosen for this and they're chosen for that. He just says, realize you are a unique nation that has a very specific role in this world, and there is a role for you to do. Moshe doesn't explain what everyone else does because the Torah wasn't written for everyone. It was written for the Jewish people. So it'd be like me telling my kids, you guys need to wash the dishes, you need to dry the dishes, and you need to make your beds. And then like my oldest saying, oh, but you didn't tell me what all my friends are doing tonight. You know what? I'm not their parent. It's not my responsibility to tell you. I'm not getting involved in this right now, what their job is. Or if I go amongst the children themselves, if my son says, oh, you didn't tell me what my daughter's doing. I tell my son, excuse me, you don't need to know what my daughter's doing. I'm talking to you about your job. So Moshe tells us what our job is, not to diminish anyone, but just to focus on what it is and to realize that what we're doing is unique. And if we don't do it, then the whole world falls into a point of disrepair. Now, I want to take it a step further. What is our job? Every human has a purpose. Everyone comes from Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve came from the Garden of Eden, and they were given very specific tasks. L'avda l'shamra, guard and work the world. And everyone guards and works this world in different ways. It is the role of Jewish people to bring spiritual awareness and spiritual consciousness into this world via the medium described in the Torah, the mitzvahs. And that when we do that, we bring a spiritual balance into this world that nobody else is able to achieve. Everyone achieves their own balance, but this is our balance. This is our contribution, not to Jewish community, not to Jewish continuity, but actually to the global well-being. Not only global well-being, but for the whole purpose of why Hashem created the world. Hashem has a desire for what Hashem wants to see in physicality and placed a certain soul type in order to achieve a specific aspect of that. And that soul type is the Jewish soul type, born into a particular person. So a person can't walk around and go, ha ha, I've got a Jewish soul. That makes me better. No, it doesn't. If you're doing what you're meant to be doing, great. And if you're not doing what you're meant to be doing, what's the point of having the soul? So it's like someone who's got an electrician's certificate, and they walk around going, I've got a Sparky certificate. I went to wherever I went to train. I've done my apprenticeship. Here it is. Yeah, but do you actually work as an electrician? Nah. Got no. So what do you do? I actually talk about concrete pouring. It's like, why? What's the point of your certificate? Oh, the certificate, it's because that's who I am. No, it's not. So to be Jewish is not just to walk around and go, I'm Jewish. To be Jewish is to say, I've got an neshama, you chose me for a very specific thing. I may want to get involved in all sorts of things, but you, Hashem, have given me a particular role, and I must live up to that role. And Moshe says before he dies, which is what Parshas Kisaveh, it's right before he dies, he says, my friends, my people, you're going to get involved in so many different things in this world, and there are going to be so many interesting things, but it's not for you to get involved in everything that happens in this world. There are different people, different nations, different talents. You have a particular role. 613 methods of spiritual connection. Nobody can bring spiritual consciousness into this world in the way that you can. But there are other spiritual people, other religions in this world. Beautiful. They play a role as well. And not only do they play a role, the world needs them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. Maybe they're doing things correctly. Maybe they're doing things incorrectly. Just like us. We need to work our way through this. We all need to understand what is it that Hashem wants. And each one of us plays our role. We happen to have a very refined role. spiritual consciousness. That sounds pretty full on. That's very different to environmentalism. That's very different to social equality financially. These are all important things. We don't need to do them all. Everyone needs to do their role. So, when Moshe says in this week's Pasha, "You have been chosen," we now understand what chosen means. It's not a being better. It is a very, very. It is a particular. It's an instruction to carry on and do that which our responsibility in this world actually is. Are there any questions? No? Cool. Let me just see what comments I got. Just if any questions here. Okay. So that is it for this week. Let me just